Thank you so much for giving us time. Just wanted to start off by speaking to you about SME loans. In a recent speech, you called the situation quite perverse because lending has declined. Do you acknowledge there was a problem? What are you going to do to help them?
Well, there is a serious problem with SME lending, for sure, and it is a consequence of the bank crisis and collapse in 2008, 2009. Banks overreacted, partly because tougher regulation stopped lending to what they regarded as risky businesses, and a lot of SMEs have been very badly damaged by it. What are we doing about it? Well, the government has been trying to get the bigger banks lending more, and some of them have responded, like Lloyds and Santander. Others, like RBS, haven't. We've established this business bank, which is helping to support new banks, new types of lending. It's of internet-based crowd financing and asset finance, invoice finance, all kind of new streams of funding. And we've established a startup loan scheme, which is for beginners. And I was just checking the numbers. About currently 37% of all the loans, and it's now over 13,000, go to BME businesses. That's not by design. It's just they've come up with good applications. So that certainly help.
NICLEP commissioned a report last year, and it showed that Asian and minority-owned businesses, small businesses, do have difficulty accessing loans. Startup loans are a different aspect, but the situation is more pronounced for minority businesses.
Well, I think it's pronounced. I mean, all SMEs have problems getting loan finance from the banks. That's a general problem, but I think that study did tend to show they had disproportionate difficulties, and we have referred that to the British Bankers Association and asked them to make absolutely sure that there is no discriminatory element in their lending. And they're now making available to us lending by postcodes, so we can measure much more meaningfully where the money they lend is actually going, and that will help us to, obviously in a very indirect way, to assess that lending is not being skewed in a damaging way.
Sure. The Prime Minister has promised to help small businesses, and a lot of our readers who own small businesses struggle to understand what tangible help is out there. What can you say to reassure our readers that this is not a pre-election promise?
Well, apart from the lending issue, which you've talked about, I mean, the main step the government's taken over the last few months is on business rates, which was very, very difficult for people on the high street, and we have capped the increase. We've increased the scheme for small traders getting rate relief. We're now in the process of consulting on changing the system so that you have potentially annual revaluations, so bringing rentals and rateable values more closely into line. And I'm certainly pushing within government to have the whole business rate scheme radically overhauled. So lending, the rate relief, rate reform, and deregulation. We try to do it in a measured way, but some of the sillier HSE rules, health and safety, some of the planning regulations have been simplified to make it easier for small businesses to grow and expand.
With tobacco legislation and the government U-turn on it, there is a worry among corner shop owners that they're going to lose revenue, and it's going to lead to a spurt in organized crime and smuggling. What can you say to reassure them?
Well, I've always had a good interaction with the basically news agents and other retailers who market cigarettes. I've tried to listen to their point of view, but the fact is that the government has to do something for public health reasons about young people getting easy access to cigarettes, and so the display ban was something where there was a very strong momentum behind. However, as a result of the representations I have made in government, and indeed the shopkeepers have made the same point, we have postponed the introduction of the display ban for the small traders. So they get two years leeway, I think it is, as against the supermarkets who are already having to apply it. So they've got some relief. But there was a problem. Far too many young people are smoking, and it kills them, prematurely. So, we had to take action.
I want to. You spoke about rate relief. Some of our readers are pharmacists as well, independent pharmacists. Yeah. If the NHS wants to make savings, and efficient savings at that, the tax rates for larger companies have been cut from 28% to 20%, but among smaller companies it's still 20%. Will this change?
Well, I don't know what will happen in the budget tomorrow. I think small business corporation tax rates also been cut over the last few years. I know that the main headline rates come down more, but I think small businesses have been helped as well. And you see, there are other respects of the tax system in which small companies benefit and big companies don't. I mean, a classic example is capital allowances for investment. That goes up to, I think, 250,000. So, for the big companies, it's nothing. But for small, medium-sized manufacturing companies, this is a big deal. So there are some respects in which the tax system has been skewed towards small companies.
Sure. Okay. Given the fact that Asian communities have been here for 2 generations now, does it surprise you that there are too few Asians and minorities in the boardrooms? What is the government doing to address this diversity deficit?
Well, I'm very keen on promoting diversity in the boardrooms, and we've had a particular push on women, as you know, who were massively underrepresented. I'd like to see more diversity in a general sense. It's a little difficult to do this in a very prescriptive way, because what do you say? That each boardroom should have one ethnic minority representative, but what are we talking about? Black, Asian, mixed, whereas men and women, it's very clear cut what you're trying to achieve. It's more difficult in the boardrooms. And I think the other point I would make is that we do, although they come from overseas, our leading businesses are led by ethnic minorities. I mean, the biggest manufacturing company in Britain is Tata, which is an Indian company, and a brilliant company, and they provide vast amounts of employment here. I mean, they happen to be headquartered in Mumbai and not in London, but that's an Indian company. It's, if you in that language, it's an ethnic minority. And many of our leading manufacturing companies are owned by people from the Indian subcontinent, big companies. So a lot of that, because of the kind of Indian business tradition, most of these are private companies. They're not publicly quoted. So they have a lot of clout in the market, but they're not necessarily FTSE 100 because, as you know, the history of very few Indian companies have publicly. It's a different model of business.
Sure. With women, are you in favour of quotas?
Not as a first line of attack, but we have always said that if the 25% target isn't met next year, we would look at quotas, but we'd prefer not to. We think it's much better to persuade companies to have diverse boards, and we exert quite a lot of moral pressure. I spend a lot of time talking to companies saying diversity is in your interests.
What's the reaction you get from them?
Well, most of them have got the message, because we don't say you must do this because it's politically correct. We say, look, actually it's stupid to ignore the talents of half the population, and indeed the talents of ethnic minorities. And it is very much in their interest to have diverse hiring. And we found as a result of talking to them, the ones that are very kind of advanced in this area value diversity in general. They're not just going through the motions of hiring more women. They see the benefits of diverse recruitment. So I think you will get more ethnic minorities alongside women. I mean, it will happen because our message is getting through.
JLR you mentioned, it illustrates the success that comes with open borders. On your trip to India in December, what concerns did Indian ministers raise about Indian businesses wanting to emulate that type of success? Did they raise concerns about what challenges they face in Britain?
Well, I think in general, Indian companies who've invested in the UK, and there are some from other parts of the subcontinent as well, but they're mainly Indian companies. And there are now hundreds of them. It's no longer just one or two. SR is another big one, but there are lots of others. And I think their experience here has been pretty positive, actually. They found it a good place to do business and are increasing their investment, and we're encouraging them. I mean, there are one or two problems around visas, which you're probably going to come to anyway. But by and large, the impression I got was that they think Britain's a good place to invest. And we talked to several companies who are currently operating in India, but as part of global supply chains, who think that it would be more sensible to do their work in the UK. So there's a two-way flow.
1 in 7 companies in the UK has been started by a migrant, and Indians and Pakistanis are among the top 10 in that list. Yet, in the speech last week, you acknowledged scare stories about immigration. I want to ask, how do you strike a balance between letting investors feel they're welcome here and allaying fears about migrants taking away locals' jobs here?
Well, I think we have a job to do, and I do this, and some of my ministerial colleagues do the same. We think we do have a responsibility to calm down these panics which are created, which often has no objective basis. Most of the recent excitement on the migration front has actually not been about the Indian subcontinent. I mean, it is primarily about Europe and the Romania and Bulgaria and the accession countries and so on. So, the arguments about the Indian subcontinent we had back in the 60s and 70s, and the East African Asian dramas and so on, which I was heavily involved in. I mean, that's no longer with us. I mean, I think the issue as far as the Indian subcontinent is concerned is several. I mean, there are highly specially skilled people that will still have problems getting through, but I think to some extent that's been eased. And then there are issues around students, where to my mind, it's completely absurd that we regard overseas students as immigrants, because they're not here as immigrants. They're here to study, and the vast majority of them go home at the end of it. But because of a United Nations classification, they are counted as immigrants because they stay for over a year. So that's, in order to get immigration numbers down, the Home Office has concentrated on students, which has had all kind of negative effects, mainly perception, actually, because we haven't got a cap on student numbers, but nonetheless people in India particularly believe they're not wanted anymore, and there's been a big decline. It's not generally true. There's been a big increase in Chinese students.
But Indian students, the percentage went down.
Yes, it did. No, it is, and it's very sad because they were very good. They were very welcome here, and the universities were very keen to have them. But they were scared off by the publicity a few years ago, which I think wasn't warranted, because they're still very welcome if they come as university students.
Is this a difficult conversation for you to have with your colleagues in the Home Office?
Well, it's past difficult. It was difficult initially, but we now just take a different view. And we, and it's not just a party political. Some of my conservative colleagues feel exactly the same way, that we should have a more open approach to talent from overseas, and the Home Office has a different agenda. We, because we're in the same government, we have to reach compromises, which we do. So it's not ideal, but nonetheless, it's nothing. It's not actually, the system is nothing like as bad as people in India believe it is.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that you'll reach some sort of compromise?
Well, we have reached a compromise. There is no cap on student numbers, but it is now more difficult to get a visa, particularly for post-study work. And and I and David Willits, my colleague here, would like to see a more open system with greater freedom to work after study, for example. But we've reached a compromise for the moment.
With engineers and scientists in the next couple of years, it has been acknowledged that Britain will face a shortage. What do you think needs to be done in terms of attracting top talent?
Well, as I said, it's just the same answer as before. I think we do need to have an open regime, and immigration needs to be managed, but it needs to be open to talent and skilled people. I did make the comment at the Mansion House, which you got the photograph for, that I was, quote, seriously relaxed about skilled people coming here and contributing to Britain and paying taxes, and that is my view. And engineers are amongst our scarcity occupations. Now, if I was the Home Secretary, what I would be saying is, well, that's fine, but we do have to train our own people, don't we? And that is also true. And if I give another example outside of engineering, it isn't right that Britain continues to depend on nurses from Zimbabwe and countries like that. We should be, we should be producing more of our own nurses. And the same thing applies in engineering. We've got to do much better in getting engineering apprenticeships and engineering degrees. We are working at it. So there is a combination of developing our domestic skill base, which is imperative, but also being flexible and encouraging people from overseas where there are genuine gaps in the market.
You've been in coalition politics for 4 years now. How's it been? How would you describe it? And what do you find are particularly challenging?
Well, it works. The government does a lot of very radical things. If you look at the things we've done in this department, we've done an enormous amount in the last 4 years. Far more than was ever accomplished in previous periods. Massive reform of higher education, apprenticeships, the launching of industrial strategy, 2 new banks that we've launched, reform of intellectual property rights, changing the system of remuneration, our big offensive on women on boards. About a dozen things that we've done. So it's a government that works. It is. I have very different political views from the Conservatives, but by being businesslike, you can strike compromises, you get on and deliver stuff.
Do you envisage having an Asian Lib Dem MP in 2015?
I would hope so, yes, because we haven't got enough. We are. I think we're on track to significantly increase the number of women in our parliamentary party, which is also woefully small. We haven't got any Asian MPs since we lost Pramjit in Leicester, and we should have, and because we have had quite a strong Asian support base, and we've got a lot of very good people in local government, and there are several seats where Asian candidates have been adopted, and we will be putting as much effort in to make sure they actually win.
Are you open to partnering with Labour?
Well, it's not. We're open to it after the election, depending on what the outcome is. We've always said it's the public must decide what the next government is. We don't pick and choose, and the numbers will determine whether you have a single party government or a coalition, and which coalition it is would depend on how the numbers come out. But certainly there's no reason in principle why we shouldn't work with Labour if that's what the